Hi everyone, my name is Licia Henneberg, and right now I'll be presenting my research on whether competition changes the relative importance of absolute and relative standing feedback. So what this question is kind of based on is three independent variables. First is absolute feedback, which in this case kind of means the number of questions right out of a total, say. Then you compare that to relative standing, which is just how you do on, say, an exam in comparison to everyone else who took that exam. And so what research shows is that absolute standing tends to have a greater effect on the satisfaction with performance of people who are taking, say, an exam. Then when you bring in our third independent variable, which is competition, we're sort of measuring to see if there are any changes. So competition is based really heavily in the area of social comparison because social comparison is essentially just comparing your ability to those of the people around you. And since research shows that in a competition setting, there is a much a heightened level of social comparison. So we're wondering if the idea of a relative score might take more effect in such a highly competitive area as the one we're trying to simulate. And so we're wondering, does the effect that has been shown by research of absolute score sort of flip-flop in a competitive environment? And my hypothesis is that it would. So for our first study, we gathered 100 undergraduates in introductory psychology classes at Western Kentucky University, and we separated them into 8 different groups. So half went into a competition group and half went into a non-competition group. And then each of those were separated into 4 feedback groups of absolute and relative scoring varieties. So for the competition group, we primed our participants by telling them that their scores would be compared to the others who took who participated in the same study. Then we told them that if they scored in the top 10 participants of everyone, then they would be called back for a second phase of the study. So after participants were either primed with this extra information or that was left out, they took 6 ACT math questions. And after those questions were completed, they received their fictional feedback, which was separated into the 4 groups. So they were either told that they received a high absolute score, which was 4 out of 6 questions correct, or a low absolute score, which is 2 out of 6 questions correct. And then they were either told that they received a high relative score, which was performing better than 70% of everyone who had taken part in the study, or a low relative score, which is better than 30% of everyone. So upon receiving that feedback, we measured our dependent variables. In this case, we measured affect, satisfaction with performance, and the prediction of performance. So we used the PANAS survey for affect, the satisfaction with performance survey, and then to predict performance, we simply asked students to guess how many questions right they would get on the next part of the study, which was just another set of ACT math questions. And so what we found, if you'll direct your attention to our figures, first was that absolute and relative standing respectively impacted the predicted score. So students who received a high absolute score predicted that they would do so again. And students who, say, received a low relative score predicted that they would receive a low relative score in the second phase. We also found for satisfaction with performance that absolute feedback had a significant effect on a predicted or on a satisfaction score. So participants with a higher score were more satisfied than those with lower scores. But we found that this effect did not hold true for relative scores. And so relative scores did not actually have an impact or a significant impact on satisfaction that we could find. Finally, we found that affect was affected by competition priming. So for the competition group, a high absolute feedback reduced negative affect. But for the other groups, we couldn't really find a connection between the competition and the affect levels. And so we finally found that relative scores only really mattered when the absolute score was low to begin with. So at that point, students may begin to compare themselves to other students and value that feedback more. But if there was a high absolute score to begin with, students essentially disregarded the relative score entirely. And so essentially what we found was just in accordance with previous research on absolute and relative scoring. We didn't find a very significant difference between the competition and non-competition groups. And for that reason, we were beginning a follow-up study before COVID-19 struck. And so with that second study, we're hoping to improve our competition priming to maybe heighten this difference, the small difference that we found for affect, and maybe see if it will carry across to the other dependent variables. And to do that, we implemented a different priming method that would tell students that their scores would be shared with others. We're also hoping, of course, to expand our sample size to see if we can show a greater significance in the results that we did find. But mainly we're hoping to really increase that competition aspect to our study.